Matthew is the only gospel to explicitly talk about the church. And remember when Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ in Matthew 16, Jesus says, that could not have come from human logic. And that confession is the rock upon which the church will be built. So that's a clear indication, clear discussion. In Matthew 18, we have discussion about church discipline, so to speak. That if somebody offends you, you should go to that person. If they're not open, then you should take another witness, and then it kind of keeps talking about it. The whole discussion there is really about the protection of followers. So for instance, if you're in a situation where somebody in leadership is doing something to be harmful, then that needs to be dealt with for the protection of the rest of the flock. So again, those I think are very, very important. In Matthew 24 and 25, we also have a very clear focus about the kingdom and eschatology, the last days, the last times, where we get things like you have to be ready. So in that context, we have the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 were ready, 5 weren't. In other words, we can't get so comfortable in this life that we miss the unexpected arrival of the bridegroom, or the parable about the sheep and the goats. So there's a number of parables that are also very highly linked to judgment and the reality of final judgment. Now, just to wrap some of these things together, this is where people will look at Matthew's gospel and say it has high Christology. And what's meant by that is that we have that very clear opening statement. Remember that Jesus is the son of David and the son of Abraham. That's pretty high Christology. That's saying that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of those things, one person, fully God, fully human. We also looked at excuse me, some of the other things about the emphasis on Jesus as the true Davidic king, the Lord, the Son of God. So those are indications in Matthew's gospel that show us the high Christology. I also put as a separate category the appropriation of the Old Testament. In classes on hermeneutics, we could talk about this more, but in essence, what Matthew does is he actually gives us an insight in how to read the Old Testament. Now, I was talking again, the first comment I made was how the Old Testament points to Jesus. That's more of a theological comment. But if we look carefully how Matthew understands, we also get a little lesson in hermeneutics, how to interpret the Old Testament. How is the Old Testament intended to be read in light of Christ? And that's also an important contribution. What I'd like to do right now is to underscore just a few, each time we're in a new part of the New Testament, I'd like to give us a couple of key verses, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some metaphors, some parts of the Sermon on the Mount. And then I'd like to make a couple of comments quickly about the Lord's Prayer, probably one of the most famous parts of Matthew's Gospel. So let's go ahead and let me just make a comment quickly. I've alluded to this verse several times. The Matthew 16:16 is a very important verse. Verse 15, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that is really one of the clearest confessions about who Jesus is, the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, I've alluded to that passage in talking about the fact that that confession is the basis of the church. So that's a very, very key point in Matthew's Gospel. And of course, we have to look at the very end of Matthew's Gospel, the Great Commission. And I'll just read this. This is the very end of Matthew's Gospel. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came and said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. I just have to kind of comment as we go along, but that is incredibly high Christology. That expression on heaven and earth is one that we find running through the Old Testament in descriptions of the Lord, of Yahweh. And clearly an indication that the Creator God has all authority. So now Jesus is saying, all authority has been given to me. Therefore, based on that authority, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Now, this is more of a theological comment, but I'd like to weave in some theology along the way. Sometimes people say, well, the New Testament itself does not explicitly teach about the Trinity. That could be problematic for a school with our name. But what I would like to point out is that the Trinity is the logical conclusion of the evidence that we have in the New Testament. So sure, if we're looking for a word Trinity, we're not going to find it in the New Testament. But if we're going to look at the Greek, which I love to do, if we're going to look at the Greek structure of verse 19, that's a prepositional phrase, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. The way that that is written in the Greek makes it impossible to make any other conclusion than, aside from the fact that we have three entities, three persons, one God. If we were talking about that the Father equals the Son, equals the Spirit, then the grammar would be different. So the point that I'd like to make here is a very clear affirmation of the Trinity. And if you didn't have an understanding of the Trinity, this would be a very difficult verse to understand. So it is clearly affirming three persons, one God, to use a later formulation of that. So baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you to the very end of the age. I mean, think about that. Baptism is a picture of placing people into the faith, teaching them to obey all that I've commanded. That's the essence of Jesus' teaching. And then a final assurance that Jesus will be with his followers till the end of the age. So it's for good reason that people have looked at the Great Commission throughout the centuries.